Welcome to Planet Poetry. I'm Peter Kenny.
And I'm Robin Houghton. And in this episode, we're talking to the poet and author Clare Best about her work and her forthcoming collection.
And we'll talk about the beguiling temptations of working in prose and that four-letter word, work.
Work as in stuff we do to pay the bills, not, writing or anything interesting like that, clearly. But anyway, before all that, let's hear what Clare Best had to say to Peter.
Clare Best has two full poetry collections, Excisions, Waterloo 2011, a finalist for the Seamus Heaney Centre Prize, and Each Other, Waterloo 2019. Her third full collection, Beyond the Gate, is due later this year from Warple Press. Other poetry publications include the pamphlets Treasure Ground, Breastless, Cell, and End of Season. Clare's prose memoir, The Missing List, Linden Press 2018, written during the last illness of her father, who had abused her as a child, was a finalist in the Dyslexia Memoir Competition 2015 and has been described as an important essential text in the context of the Me Too movement. So, Clare Best, welcome to Planet Poetry.
Thank you, Peter. It's lovely to be here.
We're chatting on a lovely April morning. Where does this day find you?
I'm at my desk, very close to the east coast of Suffolk, in fact, between Tunstall Forest and the coast. I have a sort of sideways view of the forest, which is great. And the sea is about 2 miles as the crow flies, I guess.
A kind of rural setting then. We're going to dip into several of your books, including, very excitingly, the brand new one that's yet to be released into the world, but we'll come on to that a bit later. I thought we'd open by going back to your Excisions collection, published in 2011, by visiting what I think of as a very characteristic Clare Best poem. So would you mind reading Tail Lights?
Here is Tail Lights. Driving behind you in fog, not quite day. My right foot down pulls me forward. The lights come brighter, haloed, red. So I fall back, leaving distance, cat's eyes, broken lines between us. Focus on whiteness, rime-frosted curb and grass. No sight now of your lights in freezing air. And I tell myself to tell you later, I've never known grey so beautiful, half-light so open, winter so raw and tender. I've never followed lights through fog like this before.
I really like that poem, noticing that otherworldliness of the everyday. But there's something about the following of the tail lights. You're sort of trusting that the tail lights are going to lead you to the right place in this kind of foggy, obscure world. You are noticing the fact that you're trusting, and that felt to me quite significant. Does trust play a big part in your writing, or am I completely imagining it?
I think it's enormous. I think it runs through me as a person, that theme, and my writing for sure. And its ugly sidekick, Betrayal, of course.
Yeah.
It's a very challenging one for me to think about because I didn't learn about trust in the right ways as a child. In fact, it took me a long time to understand what trust is. And I think it's about reciprocal truth, something about there being two things or two people and the truth that they each feel is between them. So as you'll know from my memoir, I grew up with a father who was utterly untrustworthy. And I think as a result, all of my early life, really, I had no kind of trustometer. I either trusted too much or I didn't trust enough. And that got me into all kinds of trouble, really. But I think Tail Lights comes from that place of a sort of push me, pull you relationship with trust, and how trust, if it really is a good and true relationship with anyone or anything, is a kind of dance, I suppose. It needs to be a bit flexible but it has to be there. And fog, I realise, always for me is a metaphor for confusion and disorientation. So I think the trust in this poem, Following the Red Light, is a kind of powerful expression of hope, really.
Part of that kind of uncertainty of what is trustable means that, when you do trust in your writing, it really shines out. And I came to your work sideways in a way. I read your memoir, The Missing List. I'd seen poems and things in magazines, but I hadn't read your collections.
The Missing List is really an account of memories of child sex abuse, which came up through the process of getting older and also realizing there were certain things that I didn't understand about myself and certain things that triggered terrible responses, panic and so on. As my father was dying, all of these things became more and more urgent. And so I began to delve into what the memories were. And so the Missing List is really a combination of looking at that and also looking back at memory and also following the last illness of my father and his death. I think there ought to be many, many more books which address lived experience of child sex abuse, because there are so many survivors and it's still happening all around us. Mostly children are abused by someone they live with. It's not really about stranger danger. So there's still very little public understanding of the kind of lasting damage that is done to people that affects them their whole life. I didn't disclose until I was in my 50s. And that's a lot of time to lose.
Indeed. It just knocked me out, the sort of multi-layeredness of it, and also the bravery of confronting the difficulty and putting it in the context of a very interesting and complicated childhood. Could you read a section from The Missing List, which also talks about your writing process, but also talks to this idea of doubt and trust in writing?
I would say that probably writing The Missing List, I had to trust the process more than in any other book or in anything else I've written, really. I felt like I was going in the dark. When did all this begin? This need to make sense of who I am, this drive to reclaim myself. Was it when my mother was recovering from breast cancer and, age 16, I sat on her bed and listened to the story of her life and her version of my father's? Was it years later, after her death in 1999, when I retreated to an armchair with the big blue scrapbook she kept throughout my childhood and studied the loops and misspellings of her handwritten account of my early years? Perhaps it began in earnest during my later obsessive viewing of those old family cine films until I knew every mote of dust, every clumsy edit. I don't think it much matters where or when it began. There's a series of beginnings, a habit. I begin and begin. I search, desperate to find out more about why I feel incomplete, but unable to read the blanks and the blankness. I only know that something vital has been lost, and without it, I can't find out what else is missing.
That seemed to me to be in day glow when I read it, because I love this idea of people writing to discover things. And also you're writing about a situation of abuse. You set off with, trepidation and almost fear about what you're going to find about yourself and in the recovery of memory. But you carry on and you do it anyway. And it's that kind of quality of bravery that I think is one of the things that inspired me so much about that memoir. When you completed it finally and it was published, did you feel like you'd expressed and kind of drawn a line under it, or did it just open new doors?
I think it was like a kind of a rebirth in a way.
Yeah.
I think that writing it was a huge kind of a roller coaster. Sometimes it was exhilarating, sometimes it was frustrating, and actually I nearly gave up so many times. and I rewrote it. It took many years, but I think when it was published, I really did feel it was a combination of a huge weight coming off, but also a sense of sort of other things being possible finally.
Yeah.
Because I think there was a part of me that was basically dead from the age of very small to when I published it.
Yeah.
And so it was this kind of rediscovery of the rest of life. It made other things possible.
In your writing, there's that kind of those rediscoveries. I think that's one of the reasons they feel so fresh. You are coming to yourself again after such a long period of numbness. The book is so multi-layered, but you find yourself in the situation where you're having to look after him as he's dying, and also take dictated notes from him about his account of life and so on. I mean, it seems to be you were put in an impossible situation, and yet this situation has resulted in such a marvellous, multi-layered book that doesn't become in any way a sort of misery memoir. It doesn't overemphasize one thing. It's part of a complex life and a process. Somehow in the writing, you seem to get those terrible things that did happen to you in a kind of perspective. And that's incredibly heartening. I found when I read it, your ability to sort of place it within a narrative that's so full and varied.
I wanted to include my father's voice in the book,
Yeah.
which felt both kind of very risky and transgressive.
Mm.
But for me, it was very important. He asked me to take this recording of his own memories as he was dying. And of course, he didn't know what I was up to.
Yeah.
So there was this very strange sense that I was listening. Part of me wanted to do my best by him, oddly enough.
Yeah.
But I was also doing my best by me. That was very empowering. And I kept a diary, I kept a journal through the last 2 years of his life, really, because it allowed me to cope with what was happening. And that became a lifeline for me. Writing that, even when I was exhausted, became what enabled me to cope with the day-to-day. But also later, I was able to use parts of that journal to make the framework for the book.
Yeah. One of the things I really admire about your writing is that you don't flinch from taking on these extremely difficult subjects, but also there's something else. There's a kind of, I think of it as a territory in your writing that is very enigmatic and poetic. That sounds a ridiculous word, but there's something in your writing that takes me to somewhere else, a kind of otherworldly place that is just devastatingly beautiful. The first poem of the book, Each Other, is called Moon House, and that seems to exemplify for me this territory that you sometimes dip into, which I find particularly spellbinding. Would you mind reading that for us?
Of course. Moon House. We come from an empty room where we slept on cold air. There's ice in the grass. Night is an envelope. There have been other moons, spills of orange, clear faces, crescents framed by windows, coins turned in pockets. But oh, this deluge of light, vast, slow invasion of the house, making a space for the dead and the living, a dance floor for wounds and blessings. This moon conjures phantoms. She writes our shadow names on her invitation.
You see, that's one of those poems that I could read and reread because it does have that ambiguity, but it just takes me to a beautiful place. I mean, there's the thing about the moon in phenomenology, in philosophy. There's from Hegel, he points to the moon and says, look, this time it's a crescent, this time it's a full moon, this time it's this colour. We know it's the same thing, but its appearance is constantly changing. And there's something about that contradiction in this, that there's the different kinds of moons, that this is a place of wounds and blessings, a space for the dead, but it's also the living and a dance floor. It contains all those kind of opposites, but in the same space. How do you account for this, Claire?
Yes. Well, in literal terms, I think, I mean, it's interesting and helpful for me to sort of think where this poem first started. It was just as we were moving to this new house in Suffolk, which we did in 2018, as the missing list was about to be published.
Mm.
And we were at that stage camping. We were coming here at weekends and sleeping on a very, very cold floor on an airbed. So there's a kind of literalness about the detail of this. And I would get up in the night and wander into the sort of open plan living space, which has very high windows. And I would get these glimpses of this world beyond the missing list, I think.
Yeah.
And so it's a very powerful, evocative sense of the moonlight coming, a sort of very, very natural thing, but it's a new kind of light coming into a new space, which I'm already inhabiting and kind of feeling my way into. So
it feels very cleansing, doesn't it?
I think it does. And I think it is full of that kind of feeling of new beginnings somehow.
Mm.
And a feeling that, interestingly, I was suddenly very happy to live in this open plan space. And I think there was something incredibly liberating for me about everything now being joined up and open and being able to talk about what had happened to me and my book about to be published. And it really was like a rebirth. So I think there are elements of that in the poem. Night, for me, used to be quite a frightening thing. And I think this is also a kind of ability to inhabit the night and to kind of embrace those dream aspects of life that tend to happen more at night than in the day. And strange proximity in a way of dreams and poetry. You know, I think there are quite a few poems about dreams in my new book. In a dream, as in a poem, you can go through a portal into some other space.
Yeah. When you wrote a poem like the Moon House, for example, do you think your mood and everything had changed and you wrote this poem? Or did you think the act of writing the poem kind of flipped the switch in a way? What comes first in your mind?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think the urge to write something usually allows me to feel that thing. And I'm sometimes not very good at recognizing my feelings. So as I write and discover them, what's happening, it's a double process, if you like.
Yeah. I'd like to return, if we may, to the missing list again.
18th of January, 2009. Can't stop thinking about Dad. A heady mix of my own frustration and anger at him is cocktailed with a weird and illogical compassion. His sadness released in me. 1 minute I want him to die. I want him to go away, and especially I want him never to have been. Then I feel compelled to try and understand who he is, why he's like he is. All this thinking seems to remake the world, shift the weather and the season, let rain fall and sun come through. A chaotic alchemy of telling and listening is at work. I've no idea yet what the outcome might be, though in odd moments I can see, in tiny shining glimpses, beyond all this history and beyond the present, to another life after my father's life has ended. And where did my father's story and mine first truly intersect? It wasn't when I was born. The flowers were in the fridge and my father was not there. It was a bit later, perhaps, when he first began to focus on me with that Bolex cine camera.
I found that so chilling, that idea of suddenly being seen and singled out in a different way. Book is a kind of interlacing of memories, but this is not a book about memory. They're kind of absolutely live emotions. They feel live when you're reading. Was it a therapeutic process for you writing it?
I was simultaneously writing the book and involved in a very long psychotherapeutic journey. And actually the two things ran in parallel. So there was a sense for me that I was going through this very, very difficult, challenging, exhausting process of trying to look into the past and make some sense of it in a therapeutic setting. And at the same time, I was desperately trying to put together this account. So there was a therapeutic aspect to writing it, although in the early days, I think it was far more maddening and far more frustrating than anything else.
Yeah.
Because when I first started writing it, I didn't know what it was that was coming to me. The memories emerged and I wrote them down, and I didn't know what they were, what they meant. I certainly didn't think of it as being a book. And it wasn't until years later that I wanted to make it into something that could actually be put out into the world. And even then it was still frustrating because the form took ages to achieve. But as I was doing that, I was in fact putting myself back together. So in a way, looking back, I can see that it was therapeutic, even though it didn't feel like it at the time.
When you were writing the missing list, did you think of how it might impact your readers? Because I found it extremely empowering, and I'm sure I'm not alone.
You're not alone. I mean, I actually worried quite a lot, obviously, about how it would impact readers and how certain parts of it would impact readers. I worried about negative reactions as well as positive ones. But I've heard from so many people who have found it as an approach to my past that it helped them to face difficult memories of grief as well, because my grief for my father was complex, obviously. So I think addressing all of those things, hearing back from readers was very moving for me. It really made a sense of the whole thing having been hugely worthwhile, and still does.
You said in an email that you saw it as part of the same project as your poetry in a way. As I said before, I think bravery is very characteristic of what you do. You've written about your elective double mastectomy, as well as your relationship with an abusive father. And in your little pamphlet Cell, which I really liked, the protagonist there was a 14-year-old girl called Christine Carpenter, who was walled up in a church in 1329. And even when she tries to leave and is allowed out, she's sent back by the bishop. There's an element of accepting fate about that. Do our past experiences lead us towards a kind of fate in our lives that we have to do certain things because of where we've been?
It's an interesting one. It's something to do with walking the path that you make, or walking the path that's been made for you. Or I have a feeling that when I wrote Cell, I was looking at acceptance of fate, if you like, being one of the ways that things could have gone for me. And, if certain other things hadn't happened in my life after that childhood, I think things could have been very different if I hadn't met my husband, if we hadn't decided to spend our lives together and so on. But so Cell is my take on the worst possible, if you like. And what I hoped not be the case for me, and what I desperately hope is not the case for. But in Cell, she tries to get away, so she's not accepting, although she is forced back into her cell and Cares's cell by another male. And so she is a captive, I think. Yeah. And I think I felt the story so strongly because I was a captive, first to abuse and then to the legacies of that abuse for many years. And I think there were certain aspects of it that I accepted. I think I am quite good at accepting when I have to. But with luck, perhaps, acceptance turns to tolerance, which is a far more active way of being.
Yeah.
And in turn, tolerance can grow into resilience, I think. Back to your point about there being sometimes a fate associated with certain things in your past, I think there is no forgetting. There is no forgetting. So I'm sometimes aware that I walk an edge, that there are dark moments, and I muster my strength and my resilience, and then I go on again, and that's fine. I've managed to withstand my past, but in becoming more resilient, I think, interestingly, I think you also realise your vulnerability.
Despite the difficulties you face as a child, family still seems a great source of strength for you, especially, you know, in your work when your husband and your son appear. In the collection, each other contains a section that really looks at the relationships you gain strength from. There's a beautiful poem called The Long White Dress of Love. Could I ask you to read that?
Yes, indeed. The long white dress of love. They stand, side by side. The air silvers. She is candle. He is charcoal. Both burn when they kiss.
Such a lovely poem. And it's really very characteristic of many of the poems in that collection, in that you show how one relationship is made out of two different elements. And in the poems, you're kind of interleaving you and your partner's characteristics and peculiarities and making this new thing out of it. You know, she is candle, he is charcoal, but, you know, they're both burning. It's a thumbprint of your love poetry. There's another poem, He Hasn't Always Seen Through Her. Could you read that for us?
Yes, this section of the book, Each Other, which is a long sequence of poems about a him and a her. And some of them inevitably are written from my own experience and from my relationship with Philip. But many of them aren't as well. So it's a kind of combination of a fiction and our own truth.
So we can't run our fingers along these poems and think, aha.
No, certainly not all of them. He hasn't always seen through her. She used to be quite opaque. He thinks some parts have altered over the years. Hands, thorax, head and neck. Now, sitting beside her when she's at the wheel, he sees through skin, fat, what's left of muscle, to capillaries, arteries, veins, tendons and ligaments, the strange mechanicals of wrists and fingers. He watches ribs and pelvic girdle shift as she changes gear. When she turns to speak to him, he sees her vocal cords stretch and thin before they start to vibrate. A tide of spinal fluid is washing her brain. Her tongue flaps in the bony cave of her mouth.
I love the oddness of that in a way. It's a wonderful metaphor, I expect, for many things, but it makes me feel that sort of uncomfortableness of being known so well and seen so deeply, being seen warts and all, is good and bad as well, isn't it? You know,
it is.
There's no
Absolutely.
illusion.
Yeah, there's no escape. There's no hiding.
Yeah. So I'd like to move on, and I'm really excited about being able to dip into your new collection before it's even been published. Have you finalised the name for your collection?
Yes, it's Beyond the Gate.
And when is that going to be released into the wild?
Well, it's coming. The scheduled publication date is June the 1st.
Oh, excellent.
Yes, so quite soon.
So readers of your work will be reassured that because I've seen an early PDF of it, and there's some absolutely gorgeous work in here. Can we dip in and hear a poem from it?
Sure. Rising in the night in summer. 7 hours my son has been driving us through lush, deep grass. Although it's dark, I'm aware of an edge. I'm okay because I'm in the passenger seat, but in fact I'm not okay because I'm stiff with fear. My son is in the driver's seat nearest the 60-degree slope. He's staring resolutely ahead, and the car bounces and swerves through mist above a chalky coombe. The edge goes on, and I keep saying, "Slower, please be careful, we could go over." My son has a soothing voice. "Mum, I'm in charge. We'll be all right, I promise. But I must drive us to where we're going. The bats are there."
I love that kind of, the bats are there as an excellent reason. But it is also that thing about, there's something terrifying about having to trust other people. And again, we're in a car and driving somewhere that seems really precarious. And I always think it's kind of worse somehow when it's a family member, because it's so much easier to project your own nervousness onto them somehow.
Oh, exactly. And there's nothing like being driven by offspring for really testing that whole thing of trust between parent and child, both ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I love how you're doing it anyway, kind of thing. It's in your poetry, you're repeatedly facing your fears in a way, and that's a tremendously useful thing to be doing with poetry, if nothing else.
Yes, I think it is. Well, it's my way of looking things in the eye, and I've partly because I grew up in a family where my father, in particular, could not really look at truth and could not say what things were. And it left me with this forensic need to look at things closely and to face things and to try and work out what they are and to know them, really.
That's a tremendous gift for a writer, to keep poking at the painful bits.
My husband often says that if I hadn't been a writer, I probably would have been a forensic pathologist.
Well, that may be a nice way of leading on to this poem, which My Possible Deaths, which I think you've done an earlier version in an earlier book.
Yes, it's one of the poems that appears in the long sequence of each other. And in that book, it's called Her Possible Deaths. I sometimes think that one or two poems or part of a poem can go from one book to another. And in a way, it's like that bit of the dough that you save from one loaf and it goes into the next thing. My Possible Deaths. When I feel ready, I go down and open the front door to see more than 40 of them standing chatting. All day I wonder how many will still be there by nightfall, and I spend time finding things for their comfort. I want to make them comfortable. I arrange objects on the grass close to the house. Cushions, books, magazines, red and green apples, cheese and bread. They take what they want, then move away into the trees. I watch from an upper window. By evening, almost all of them are gone. Just 3 return the next day and the next, week after week after week, helping themselves to my offerings. I try to think of them as companions, friends.
I like that kind of a combination of possible deaths. It's almost like you've befriended them, but there's 3 of them that seem to be more persistent.
They're out to get me.
There's a feeling of calmness and accommodation and acceptance that's running through this new book that feels emotionally different to the others. When I think about, this idea of trust and so on, it occurs to me, do you have any religious faith? Are you somebody that finds ways of negotiating with the inevitable?
Well, as a younger person, I did have a strong religious faith. I was brought up in the Church of England, but I wanted to make my own way. So I converted to Catholicism in my 20s after a rather powerful religious experience, and also after a long period of depression. And now I'm a lapsed Roman Catholic convert.
Okay.
I don't very much enjoy organised religion nowadays, although I have a huge affection for all the music and liturgy, which is part of my cultural inheritance. And
Mm.
I used to sing and in choirs, and I love all of that. But I haven't really been a regular churchgoer since I found poetry seriously,
Yeah.
almost 25 years ago. And I think finding that, I sort of came out as a writer. I used to scribble away in notebooks and not do anything or show anybody what it was. And then I sort of challenged myself to actually write and share work. And since then, really, I have moved away from organized religion.
Mm.
And I'm also increasingly aware that, that somehow there's the sort of awe that you feel surrounded by the natural world is, for me, as powerful a religious experience as anything else I've known.
I've always felt walking in a wood or a forest, I always feel more connected to the idea of God there than in churches for some reason.
I'm with you on that, Peter. And I think, yes, I love walking. I mean, being around trees, on hills, by the sea, even just spending time gardening. I need a lot of quiet time, and I find I need more quiet time as I get older. And I also have a very strong sense of there being some kind of afterlife, but not in any conventional way. I think just a kind of energetic continuation, if you like. By that,
Yeah.
I don't mean the ghosts sleep around. I mean something about the energy that will continue where there are strong connections. And I think, I am naturally probably a fairly spiritual person, but my idea of living with that is to try and live well in the present, to try to be alive to the moment more than the past or the future, which doesn't exist.
Yeah. Well, I think that kind of leads us in a very nice way to another of the poems in the new collection, very much towards the end of the collection, Self-Portrait as Boundary Oak. Could you read that for us?
Absolutely. Self-Portrait as Boundary Oak. A few of us still mark the forest's edge, though some are dead or tilting. I'm fonder of bones than I was, proud of creviced bark, circles of growth, years enclosing heartwood. Each storm sways me further out over a sandy field, or in towards crowded and earthy places. It's late. I breathe, and I listen to breath. Shadows pencil my skin this cold afternoon before the green blooding of spring.
Beautiful. Well, beautiful last line as well. There's that kind of centeredness of being in the now about this boundary oak, which I really love. So, Clare, thank you so much for coming on Planet Poetry. It's been an absolute delight to have you. And I'm sure we're all going to be sitting on the edge of our seats waiting for the launch of Beyond the Gate.
Thank you so much, Peter, and such a privilege to be asked to talk about my work. It's really lovely. And yes, I look forward very much to seeing the new book, Beyond the Gate, come out in the world with Warple Press. And thank you again for having me on Planet Poetry.
I thought that was a fascinating interview. There is such a depth, isn't there, to Clare's work? The fact that you interwove her poetry with her memoir, I thought that was a masterstroke, really. It just all seemed to flow so logically together that way.
Yeah, I mean, when I sort of approached her to ask her if she wanted to talk to us, and I was talking about, did she want to talk about her memoir as well? And she was very much saying, yes, this is, she sees it all as part of her oeuvre, really. And actually, what we didn't mention in the interview was that she collaborates with classical musicians and visual artists, and, her work goes beyond what we talked about in the interview too.
Yes, she's done some amazing things. She's a great collaborator, you're right.
Yeah. She's very well known as well for her work about her elective double mastectomy. I took the decision not to talk about that simply because there's been a lot spoken and written about that. But
yeah.
you know.
You mentioned it briefly, I think. And I mean, I've been a big fan of her work since, I think, Excisions perhaps maybe was the first collection that focused on that. And it was extraordinary to read that in a similar way that when The Missing List came out, I remember reading it and one is shocked to the core at the content, but it was just stunning the way that she revealed it in this method through the book. And she talks about how she was doing one thing, her father had another thing going on. Their memories should have been the same, but they were different. It's a poetic work, isn't it?
Oh,
I think.
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, she's reviewing, family, cine film, her own notes, the dictations her father is making her take down and her own recollections and feelings. And it's a complex thing, but it's definitely one, but that's what I like about it, because it would be so easy to just write what's happened is terrible. We've seen it in so much poetry.
Yeah.
Whereas,
no, it's very much not that, is it? It's not that. And she talks about she wants to look things in the eye. She faces her fears, and one often reads a blurb about a poetry book, this is brave, etc. But I'm sorry, but this is brave. This is exposing oneself in order to come to a position of, she talks about if you can get to a position of acceptance and then tolerance, that's how she wants to live her life.
Yeah, I mean, more power to her. And her language as well is kind of, the poetry is, sophisticated, but, it's not overburdened with showy language. There's a kind of simplicity about it. Well, I was trying to point to the fact that she writes about all these, really challenging things, but there's also a space in her poetry where there's a kind of quiet magic as well, that is easy to overlook in the context of the big subjects that she's writing about.
Yes, I agree. And those kind of intimate poems are just as beautiful. And I mean, that's the little one that she read out, The Long White Dress of Love. I mean, wasn't that gorgeous? It's actually the first poem that she started with, Tail Lights. And I remember that poem, and it does have this, the two of you spoke about it afterwards, and I really loved that. She said about fog was, a metaphor for confusion, and how it was exploring this push me, pull you relationship with trust. And you asked her about this business of trust as being a theme, and she spoke so eloquently about that.
Because trust has been so difficult for her in her life, because of the way she was brought up. When she does actually get to trust people and to feel secure in her love, that there is something extra beautiful about the way she writes about that, because it's come at a cost and across a kind of veil of uncertainty to get there. It's not just something that is assumed, so reading her work really repays attention. I'd like it very much.
And very excited to hear about this new book that's coming up. She produces a lot of new work. It's always very exciting to know what's next.
Yeah, I really like it when we get, advanced copies of things, because I just think, I'm reading this before anyone else has. And, her new book is, in my opinion, really excellent and does sort of change gear into a kind a beautiful, there's a different mood to it. So Clare Best, highly recommended and eagerly awaiting her new volume.
Yes, published by Warple Press, I believe.
Yes. So Robin, I understand that the attractions of prose have drawn you away, beguiling you away from reading poetry. Can you explain yourself?
At the beginning of the year, what it's like, I don't know, certainly I like to have a new project on the go or something different. And for some reason, I joined BBC Maestro online thing. We can watch lectures from various people who are rich and famous for their craft. And they tell you basically how to do it. So you could have Carol Ann Duffy telling you how to write poetry. So, well, I didn't go for, I respect Carol Ann a great deal, but I did have a look at Lee Child talking about writing popular fiction. Because I thought, what is the absolute opposite of what I'm doing in poetry.
Unpopular poetry.
Popular fiction, exactly. And Lee Child, for heaven's sakes. But I was mesmerised by his lectures, mesmerised. I just suddenly thought, I could do this. This would be a fun thing to do. You know, I'm someone who's always said they'd never write a novel. And it's, you know, as long as the process is fun and you don't have any expectations of becoming a Lee Child, then I think that's fine. So I've been sucked into that. But I suppose what's interesting is the difference between having your poetry head on and having your prose head on. And I know a lot of poets who do also write prose. The best thing I can way of describing it is like, as a poet, you're kind of a forensic pathologist, aren't you? You know, you're picking over every last bit of dust or hair in the crime scene. But at the moment, writing prose seems to me I'm just walking in and stamping through the blood and everything, and, you know, putting on my rubber gloves and like, get the bucket out. It just feels like I'm not bothering about the small stuff at the moment because I'm still on the first draft. I'm just kind of just almost, it's almost writing itself, you know. I kind of plotted it and researched it, and that was hard work. And then when I finally got down to writing, it feels like something automatic, like automatic writing or something. I'm not editing as I go along. I'm not stressing over stupid mistakes or horrible crappy phrases. You know, I don't sort of think, oh God, that's a cliche. I just keep going. So now I'm wondering whether this kind of newfound freedom might then, at some point, when I get back to poetry, kind of flow into that. Will I find I have a different attitude to what I'm trying to write as a poet? I don't know, or whether it'll just like flip from one to the other. You know, that's it. Prose idea done, project over, fun had. Now let's get back to the serious stuff. For example, Clare, we just spoke about Clare's wonderful memoir. It seems a shame just to call it a memoir. It's this hybrid, isn't it? But she is still a poet. She is a poet writing. I feel like while I'm doing this project, I have ditched all of that. I'm just completely shot with feeling like I'm a poet. I'm right down in the dirty of the page turning, the moments and all that sort of thing.
And when you're writing a poem, you get in that beautiful mental zone, as it were, and then soon you're revising and kind of fiddling around with it. Whereas there is something about, just getting that head of steam up, being able to create momentum. You know?
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
Some people are very precious about, like Yeats or having a samurai sword on his desk or whatever, before you kick off, whereas I think there's something just about the sheer volume of what you have to produce makes you feel inevitably you feel a little less precious about what you're doing. And I think that can be good and bad. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but you expect yourself to be able to produce something every day. How many words a day are you trying to write at the moment?
Well, I've got a target of minimum 1,000 a day, but quite often I'll do 2,000. It's no.
Yeah.
But it's just the first draft, so I'll be going back and I'll be getting out the pen, and there'll be changes most certainly. But it's just to get the story down. I think at this stage, maybe there'll come a point where I become a bit more forensic, but I don't know. And I'm just wondering whether poetry workshops, sometimes they'll start with some free writing, and I've never enjoyed that. Free writing. It's like, what is free writing? I'm just wasting a load of words here. But for some people, it does free them up. And I wonder whether this is sort of a version of that yes, it's okay just to put stuff down, and not stress about the small stuff right from the get-go.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll be more able to just sit down and write poetry and not worry about it there and then. One thing I am doing, though, I'm avoiding all the advice and all the kind of, writing tips and all that stuff. And it's funny, I go to poetry workshops. Some people will never workshop their poetry, and I always think, that's a shame, not to get any feedback. But at the moment with this, I'm kind of quite happy not to, because as soon as I start stressing, someone says, oh God, you shouldn't do that because yada, yada, yada.
Yeah.
It's going to stop me in my tracks. So the only advice I've looked at is a lovely book by Louise Tonder. I think it's actually called How to Write a Novel.
Yeah.
And her method is just to break it down into small steps. And if I took nothing else away from that book, but just that, it's been worth reading because, that makes sense to me. I'm a a sprinter, not a marathon runner.
Yeah.
So small steps is good. Actually, I've taken away a lot of good stuff from that book. It's been very helpful just to sort of kick me off, I think.
Okay.
And so,
Great.
so that's it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's my excuse for not reading a lot of poetry, but I'm reading some good prose in the same way that if I want to write good poetry, I get out good poetry to read. I'm doing the same. At the beginning of this project, I thought, I better read as many popular historic novels as I can. But so many of them were so bad, I couldn't get to the end of them. So I'm just concentrating on the stuff that's good now. So I'll read The Name of the Rose. I'm reading it yet again.
Yeah.
It's my best favourite book ever.
Some
and anything by,
Eco, is it?
Oh gosh, yeah. And anything by C.J. Sansom, I'm sort of looking at again. But all the rest, the trashy stuff, Nah, not reading that, because then I'll start writing trash.
Let's aim for the stars.
Aim for the stars.
That sounds like the title of a popular novel, doesn't it?
I'll make a note of that. Maybe that's what I'll call it. How about you, Peter? Would you like to bring us back down to poetry?
Well, I have a friend that I was at university with who was incredibly intelligent man, and he turned me on to poets that I'd never heard of when I was at university, particularly Afro-Caribbean and African writers. And he's now a very esteemed professor in Detroit.
Oh, gosh.
And his name's Professor Michael Stone Richards. He sent me a link to an essay he's just written on Detroit Research, which is a website. The title is Black Labour, Notes on Work in the Black Avant-Garde. And he's looking at artists of colour. He points out that in many, particularly African-American artists, produce artwork that reflects the work they've done and talks directly about the labour that they've done. And of course, this has roots back into the work that people were forced to do during the time of slavery. Michael's pointing to a tradition in the black experience in the US and elsewhere of black people making art out of the experience of work.
Mm-hmm.
So that made me think, actually, where do we stand in terms of, writing about work? You have a pamphlet called Footwear, don't you, that was about your experience of working in a footwear corporation.
Yeah.
And I've also written a few bits about work which have kind of never taken off, or people have never been keen to publish it.
Yeah.
This is a wide sweeping generalisations, and of course there will be exceptions, but people don't often write about work, about the jobs that they do or have done, or the business of working. The two poems that came to my mind immediately were, Toads by Philip Larkin. And that's a kind of ironic kind of, why should I let the toad work squat on my life? Can't I use my wit as a pitchfork and drive the brute off? 6 days of the week it soils with its sickening poison just for paying a few bills. That's out of proportion. And he goes on. But, I've always enjoyed that idea of the work being a toad that squats on your life. But, again, no actual details about the work or what it really entails. And then there's In My Craft or Sullen Art, but, Dylan Thomas sort of, I always feel like I'm being cornered in a bar by someone. In my craft or sullen art, exercised in the still night when only the moon rages and the lovers lie abed with all their griefs in their arms, I labour by singing light, not for ambition or bread or the strut and trade of charms on the ivory stages, but for the common wages of their most secret heart. So again, it's talking about work, my craft or sullen art. But, it's just like a springboard into lofty stuff about, his own labour as a poet and things.
I'm sure people are writing this poetry, but it seems to not appeal to magazine editors or publishers, it seems to me. I do remember a while ago now, maybe 10 years ago, reading a pamphlet by someone, I can't remember his name, but it was about being a night porter in a hotel.
Yeah.
And from reading the blurb, I think he took the job in order to write about it, or it sounded a little bit contrived, not a career that had been ongoing. We know a lot of poets, don't we, who are working full-time in jobs as well as writing poetry. I mean, maybe it's because if you're in the job, you don't want to write about it. I don't know. I mean, I only wanted to write about it when I was outside of the job, looking back. So it became almost more like a way of working through memories. Exactly. It was sort of, and they were all a bit nihilistic. Although I think there were some decent poems in there. But
yes, there were.
very few of them got picked up. And I had them as a pamphlet, but nobody wanted that. So footwear was self-published, and I've gone off the bar with that now. The memories of all, they're not raw enough. But I don't know, what is the answer? Would any poets who are working like to just, tell us answers on a postcard?
Yeah.
Why are we not hearing about the photocopiers and the and the office politics and, the bitching about who's got promotion or the hot desking or layoffs? These are all...
They're real things, yeah.
They're real things, and they are...
But they lack poetry somehow.
But how do they lack poetry? We're talking about, it's what they do every day at work. There's a lot to...
It doesn't make the heart sore, though. That's the thing.
Relationships. Well, no. Well, lots of poetry doesn't make your heart sore, does it? But it hits you somehow.
Yeah.
So let's see more of it, please.
Well, I found a Japanese book called Factory Girls, which was published in 2019 by Takako Arai. And she's a poet that performs really well. And in the original Japanese, her work is very rhythmic. And she's the Factory Girls. It's all about the factory and the people that worked in there and the work. And it really puts work at the heart of what's going on in a way that I found really interesting.
I like the sound of that.
I'll read a poem from it. It's called When the Moon Rises. It is the night shift in an abandoned spinning factory. There is only a single light bulb here. The spools of thread turn by themselves. Click goes the bobbins, changed by the machines. A decade has already gone by since this place was shut down. But when the moon rises, it begins to work, its strange automation. They say that soon after the war, a factory worker's hair got tangled in the machines, killing her. There are things that float here. But this is not the work of ghosts, no. In the factory, there are peculiar habits. This is what I mean. Peculiar habits remain here. An old lady who spun thread for 44 years here still licks her index finger and twists, even on her deathbed. She cannot escape the gesture. That must be true in the netherworld too, since threads are so infinitely thin. Gestures sink into the bodies of those who manipulate the machines and possess them. Look how the raw silk thread is pulled smoothly from the factory woman's fingers, then dances endlessly. The factory is that way too. The axle of the spinning wheel remembers the molecules of steel, hang their heads in the direction in which they spin, then get caught up, clanging emptily, when the moonlight pours in. It's not just the tide that grows full. Emptily, emptily, the spinning wheels spin, the threads swim through the abandoned factory.
Gosh, I love that. All the mechanisms, all the mechanics of the factory and the people, they're all embedded, and the gestures become embedded, and the spinning and the bobbin and the hair being caught, and gosh, that's really, it's like a mini ghost story almost.
It is, yeah. And the other poems, very much go into how people behaved at work and all the rest of it. And that factory is, a character in itself. But yeah, so a way of writing about work that's, not trivial. Yeah, I really like it. So there was this quote that was nagging at the back of my mind. And
oh, yes.
Surprise, surprise. It was from W.B. Yeats. And he says, all things can tempt me from this craft of verse. One time it was a woman's face, or worse, the seeming needs of my fool-driven land. Now nothing but comes readier to the hand than this accustomed toil. Poor old W.B. Yeats grafting away at his poems.
Oh, that sums it up, doesn't it? A woman's face, or worse.